Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today we talk to political philosopher Mark Mitchell about why and how the health of the American constitutional order is connected to private property. Well, let's go. Givers, Doers, and Thinkers introduces listeners to the fascinating people and important ideas at the heart of American civil society. We speak with philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, social entrepreneurs, historians, journalists, and anyone else who will help us understand contemporary civil society's achievements and failures. We also sprinkle in practical advice for nonprofit leaders and fundraisers. My name is Jeremy Beer, and thanks for joining us. All right. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. We are recording on August 9th, 2022. Per usual, I am in Phoenix, Arizona, and I am very happy to have as our guest my good friend, Mark Mitchell, author of a new book titled Plutocratic Socialism, The Future of Private Property and the Fate of the Middle Class. Mark is Dean of Academic Affairs and Professor of Government at Patrick Henry College. He is the author of several other books, dozens, if not more than 100 articles and essays, and the co-founder of Porch Republic, a website and organization that is worth your time and where he has written about many of the ideas and themes presented in Plutocratic Socialism. Mark Mitchell, welcome.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's good to be here.
Great to have you here. First, I guess let's just start. How did you come to select such a benign title as Plutocratic Socialism?
Well, obviously, I'm trying to coin a term to describe a phenomenon that didn't seem like it had a good term to describe it, and obviously, it's what I'm pointing at is a combination of two different ideas that shouldn't work together. And what I'm increasingly seeing is that they are being joined together. Plutocracy obviously is ruled by the wealthy, and socialism is a movement, a set of political ideas that ultimately is hostile to private property. And what seems to be increasingly characterizing the American scene today is a kind of secret pact between two classes, namely the plutocratic class, that is the wealthy class, that has some other characteristics as well. We can talk about those. And also those who are crying for or decrying the free market, capitalism, ownership of property. These shouldn't work together. It's Marx sort of set out an account of capitalist society that's constructed around an adversarial relationship between the property owners, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat, the working class that have no property. And what seems to be increasingly happening in our country and even beyond is a kind of union, a partnership between these two groups that shouldn't be there. And so you have those with money and influence and power strangely supporting policies that seem to be antithetical to their own interests. And you have plenty of people in power and also a great number that aren't advocating for the reconstruction of, or the deconstruction of the system that we currently recognize in favor of something they're calling socialism. Now, that word obviously has a lot of different meanings and takes on a lot of different nuances, but something's going on here that ought not to be going on, and it would be very dismaying to Marx, because the adversarial relationship that he pointed out, he suggested was a lead up to revolution in which the proletarian class would assert themselves and overturn the property owners, throw them out, and basically socialize property, and everything would be happy. And that's not happening. And what we see is a kind of ongoing dance between these two different groups, in such a way that they come to need each other. They come to depend on each other. The plutocrats depend on giving voice to socialist policies.
Or pretending at least.
Pretending they do, because it gives them a kind of moral legitimacy to their own position. And of course, the insecure proletarian class is motivated, animated by a desire for security. And what we see increasingly is the language of insecurity, of crisis, and what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years with the COVID, with climate conflagrations and race confrontations, inflation more recently, food shortages on the horizon. All of these things create a sense of insecurity and fear. And what do insecure, fearful people do? They look to power in order to alleviate that security or insecurity and fear. And if there are no coherent, strong, thick community structures characterized by individuals who are independent enough because they own property to not look as a first impulse to the government, well, the only thing that's left is insecure citizens and the state, along with those who are who have wealth and status and position to in a sense stand aside or present themselves as messianic figures.
Is it so? There's many questions arise from your account that you just gave there to me, and it's one of the obviously one of the questions is why is this sort of phenomenon taking place? This sort of this union that shouldn't happen, as you say, at least according to sort of standard theory, between the wealthy or the high status people we might say in our society, even more than wealthy people, and those who claim at least to want socialism or something like it. Was it just discovered at some point that the way to become a plutocrat, the way to have high status, we might say more neutrally, was to generate feelings of insecurity, because that would sort of give you power?
Well, I think just to back up just a bit, I want to make it very clear that my argument is not an argument against the wealthy per se. There is what I call a kind of plutocratic psychology, which is a temptation to believe that wealth and moral virtue somehow go hand in hand. And so that if you have significant wealth, your moral virtue counts more or is more clearly developed or pronounced. And it creates a kind of insolent self-righteousness. So I'm not suggesting that all people with money are part of this plutocratic class. It is a kind of a self-righteous insolence that sees themselves as above the law, above the standards of behavior that are generally expected by society, that see themselves somehow as exempted.
Isn't it, Mark? Isn't it more like even like above the past, above
that,
right? Above that, or even above their neighbors. I'm thinking of certain signs that tend to appear in high status neighborhoods on lawns, right? In this house we believe. Very clearly, the implication being not like you and your, your house without these signs. You believe you're.
Yes, and this is something that's not new. Christopher Lasch pointed this out in the late 1990s in a book I know you're familiar with, The Revolt of the Elites, that he sees the diminishment of the middle class and a kind of free-floating elite class that no longer has a sense of noblesse oblige, a kind of moral connection to other citizens as a really serious threat to democracy. And what I'm pointing out here in this book is something that's very much in that Laschian vein. I don't think it just emerges. It's not just invented. There are certain circumstances that help to bring it about. Just go back a little bit. 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville visits America. And obviously he's French. He's familiar with the French social structure. But what struck him about America, among other things, he says, in America, there is no proletarian class. Virtually everybody owns property or wants to own property And there's a mechanism, there's a means, there's opportunity to become property owner. And he saw that small property owners were a kind of essential stabilizing feature for healthy democracy. And it's pretty simple to imagine. If you have small property owners who are significant enough in numbers in a democracy to cast deciding votes, to sort of serve as the leaven, they are going to be fairly very cautious about taxation. Tocqueville says nothing damages a small fortune more than a minor tax. That they're going to be allergic to taxation, which is to say there's kind of built-in mechanism to thwart the expansion of government power. Whereas if a dispossessed, disgruntled, insecure class of citizen has the vote, well, what's perfectly rational for them to do is to figure out ways to reallocate wealth and services to themselves. And so there's a kind of danger built in. And essentially, this is the Achilles, or one of the Achilles heels of democracy, it seems to me, is if you have a critical mass of citizens who have the vote, but don't own property and don't think of themselves as ever likely to hold property. That is a very dangerous dynamic. Every incentive is there to expand government, to expand taxation, to expand services, because they lose nothing and gain all that can be gained. And so an important question is, how do you harness, how do you limit the expansion of government? Because once it begins to expand, there's a kind of a continuation, a snowball effect. And we've been seeing that for the last 100 years or more.
Let me before you keep going on the harnessing question, maybe just put a couple of statistics on the table that are from your book that I thought were really interesting, and then this will speak to the problem, I think, and the solution, if there is one. The share of aggregate income going to the middle class went from 62%, this is in the United States, of course, 62% in 1970 to 43% in 2018. In 1945, the top 1% of households captured 4.9% of income growth. In 2018, the top 1% of households captured 58.7% of all income growth. Those are great, incredible numbers that speak to the kind of decline of the property owning class, to the extent the middle class has typically been property owning in America.
Yes. And it's really worrisome from the perspective of citizenship per se. That is, one of the things that is so essential for any healthy polity is that citizens see themselves in the same boat, playing the same game. And one of the things that I point out is kind of remarkable, even the common use of language, that both Charles Koch and Bernie Sanders, of all people, say the system is rigged in favor of those who have wealth and access. And what it does is produces those kinds of discrepancies that you just pointed out with those stats, that you have policies and procedures in place that favor the accumulation and concentration of wealth. And if you're going to have a healthy republic, and this is something that the American founders understood, it's absolutely essential that citizens think of themselves as playing the same game. And as soon as a consensus builds that the system is rigged, the very legitimacy of the system is called into question.
This is why, in your mind, to give one more set of stats from your book, in 1942, 25% of Americans said socialism would be good for the country. 1942. Now 43% say that. And twice as many people now think that socialist regimes will ultimately prevail over democratic ones, is how the survey put it.
Yes.
Those things are not necessarily antithetical in my mind. But,
exactly.
Yeah. Is that why we see this sort of a vogue for thinking that socialism is the appropriate future for us
I
to.
think so. I think it's a sense of frustration with what's perceived as a kind of illegitimate system, a system that is framed in such a way that has sort of built-in favorites. And this can be cast in various ways. It's certainly cast in terms of race. I mean, the race guru Ibram X. Kendi puts it very succinctly. He says, capitalism is essentially racist. Racism is essentially capitalist. So, well, none of us want to be racist, right? Therefore, you got to get rid of capitalism, which implies getting rid of private enterprise, the free market, and all the rest, and allocate this from some kind of all benevolent, all wise center. It's as if these people have never read the history of the 20th century.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that, but let me stop you 1 second, though. I mean, while you don't find Ibrahim Kendi's arguments persuasive, presumably, you are saying there is something, though, kind of rigged in the system right now, though, right? That instinct is not completely false, or am I misunderstanding?
Well, yeah, it all depends on what we're pointing at. And what we have now, what Charles Koch identifies as a rigged system, Elizabeth Warren says the same thing, and I think other people on the right, I mean, this is J.D. Vance is speaking this language to some extent, is that what we now call capitalism or the free market is a distorted version of the real thing. It's been distorted by the intrusion of politics that comes through regulatory capture, for instance, through lobbying. Why do all these huge corporations pay so much to hire lobbyists to go to Washington, D.C.? Why do they contribute to the campaigns of both Republicans and Democrats? They understand you got to play the game. And if you play the game, you get laws and regulations that favor you, that create barriers to entry to others that want to be involved in your particular industry, that create difficulties for competition. They're trying to create, through politics, monopolies. And monopoly is exactly antithetical to any kind of notion of free enterprise, the free market. So insofar as Kendi is saying capitalism, he's misunderstanding what the free market is. And what we really need to do is come to grips with the distortions that have been imposed into the market through politics and restore a truly free market. And I think also encourage create policies that encourage ownership of property.
I assume, I assume you're not persuaded. I want to get out in the second half of this conversation. I'm going to talk about what's special about private property. But just getting, again, back sort of down to the facts. I forget who it was. You will remember his name, maybe. He edited a later edition that ISI published of Who Owns America? Edward Shapiro, I think was his name. And if I recall correctly, in his introduction to this book, called Who Owns America, first published in the early depths of the Great Depression. He argues that, hey, actually, we live sort of in a golden age for property ownership and the widespread distribution of property, because so many people are in the market. So many people own mutual funds and stocks and equities of various sort, bonds, etc. And so, hey, that's private property ownership. That's fantastic. Everybody has this now. And said, do you find that, is that persuasive? And if not, like, what's the real state of play when it comes to property ownership in America?
Yeah, this is something that Richard Weaver, for one, points out, and other people do as well, that there's something different between embodied, real, tangible property and disembodied, abstract, chits of paper that can, in theory, go down to zero in terms of value. When you own a piece of land, when you own tools of your trade, when you own even a business with a particular location and particular that makes something, there's a kind of embodied reality that is very different than owning stock. But I think there's even a further layer of abstraction. We talk about mutual funds, for instance, when you own the fund that goes out and buys, say, stocks on the index, S&P index, in a kind of ratio according to how much is on that, and you have no effective control. You have no interest in the behavior of that company. That company could be, well, what? Using Uyghur slaves to make tennis.
Oh no, that would never happen.
Yeah, it could. I mean, it's hard. I just threw out a kind of radical notion. And all that the owners care about is, well, did the mutual fund realize a profit? And that kind of abstraction creates a kind of moral vacuousness, a moral inoculation, really, against any kind of serious consideration of what is what's going on with the property that I am, with the business that I'm supporting with my money through my ownership, that I own a part of, actually.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to talk more about that when we come back from the break, about what's special about private property and how it really works to help secure freedom and what's left of our constitutional order. Be right back with Mark Mitchell. All right, time for practicality. And we are blessed to be joined here today by my friend and colleague, Steve Bird. How are you doing, Steve?
Doing well. How are you, Jeremy?
I am well. Steve is a managing consultant in our capital campaigns group here at American Philanthropic. And we're taking a really positive spin on things here today, Steve. So I believe we're going to talk about why campaigns fail.
That's right.
Capital campaigns specifically. So, yeah, what have you seen? You've done a lot of capital campaigns work in a variety of sectors. What are the main reasons you have seen such campaigns come to pieces?
Yeah, great question, Jeremy. I would say first and foremost, campaigns fail because they do not hire American Philanthropic to help.
Wrong answer. Start over.
No, in all seriousness, like I obviously are a little biased, but I do feel like having an expert help you through the process is really invaluable. I would say it's the exceptional organization that can do a campaign on their own internally. It just, the experience, and not to say there's anything, particularly like sophisticated necessarily, but having somebody to kind of coach you through the process and hold you accountable is just really invaluable. Campaigns take a lot of work. Most organizations already are very busy and tasked with a lot of different things. So to add a campaign on top of their already busy schedule is a big ask.
It's always amazing when we talk to somebody and they want to do like a $10 million campaign and do it with their existing staff, and they're raising $3 million a year, $2 million a year. That's pretty much a prescription for failure right there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, not to say that you can't do it if you have the right leadership and the staff in place, but it's much harder to accomplish that, and especially within the time frame that you want to accomplish that. I think it can drag out. You're not really accountable to anybody other than yourselves and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's part of it too. I like that. Like just having an external partner to whom you're accountable. We all know how that works. Our accountability buddies help us actually do what it is we have said that we want to do. All right. So not having an outside partner to help you through it for a lot of different reasons is one reason campaigns fail. What's another one?
Another one would be not really doing the due diligence up front. And that would be first and foremost a feasibility study to see really if you can succeed and what your supporters really think about your idea and whether they would get behind it or not. So not only does it answer that really important question, but it also helps you in actually running the campaign well. It kind of stacks the deck in your favor. Mm-hmm. And really, I mean, yeah, campaigns can be challenging no matter what. We don't want to shy away from challenging things, but if you can make it, if you can kind of rig the game, so to speak, ahead of time as much as you can, it will make your life a lot easier.
We don't mean rig the game in the way you think we mean rig the game,
right?
Dear listener. But it's a good point. I mean, giving yourself every possible advantage when you're trying to raise a lot of money seems smart. And it's funny, we'll talk to groups sometimes, Steve, right, who we know and they know they can almost certainly raise the $20 million, the $2 million, whatever it is they're trying to raise in their campaign. But you should still do the feasibility study, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, again, not only does it just give you the opportunity to check in with your supporters before you actually go out and ask them to make significant contributions, but it really does, help you see whether or not you can be successful in the long run.
Right. What's one more reason why campaigns fail?
I would say the biggest reason I've seen is it's probably not going to be something a lot of people want to hear, but is that you don't have the buy-in at the top of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
So, wherever it is, if it's the president, maybe it's the pastor, maybe it's the principal of a school. If they aren't making it one of their top priorities, it's doomed to underperform.
That's not. It doesn't matter how good your outside partner is, and if that's the case.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, I think a lot of times it's not something people are really excited about. I had a pastor tell me once, "Well, my Lent is going to be the campaign. That's going to be." And I understand that. It's not necessarily what you go into, your vocation as a priest or as a school principal to do. But the most successful campaigns I've seen or been a part of, the leader at the top of the organization understands that it's a fundamental part of the organization. It's not just this necessary evil they have to kind of wade through to accomplish some monetary goal. Like, it helps the organization. It kind of helps the community rally around a specific goal. And it should be a part of every life cycle of a good, healthy organization.
Yep. I agree. Hey, great stuff, Steve. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy.
Talk to you soon. All right, we are back with our guest, Mark Mitchell, author of Plutocratic Socialism, The Future of Private Property and the Fate of the Middle Class. And we were just starting to talk about, Mark, that private property is different. A tangible private property is different than intangible and abstract private property. You call attention in the book to the role private property plays in shaping character. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think there's a sense in which ownership of property helps to cultivate virtues that are necessary for self-government. And that is when you possess something of your own that will improve with your investment. That is, if you work on it, if you attend to it, it will improve, increase in value, increase in beauty, whatever. And if you neglect it, it will decline. It will reduce or decline in value or beauty. There's a sense of responsibility that emerges, so that when you work on this, when you work on a piece of land, when you own your own business and you are investing your time and energy in that business, and it requires certain things, namely delayed gratification. You have to be able to say no to your immediate desires, your immediate appetites, for the sake of realizing a good later on. That is a huge
character shaper.
necessary character trait for democracy, for democratic citizens. If you are convinced that everything needs to be immediate, I need now, my desires need to be satisfied now, how are you going to vote? What kind of campaign promises, what kind of demagoguery will you fall prey to?
You might vote to, for instance, just print $1 trillion and distribute it to people.
You can just print $1 trillion coin. Apparently, if you just do a handful of those, you can just wipe out the national debt. There's insane things like that. You have to cultivate old-fashioned virtues like thrift, personal responsibility, and these give you the ability to think, to develop skills that can actually be used to serve your neighbor. And when you have a community of individuals with skills and with dispositions that are not given to simply demanding everything immediately, what you have is a possibility of neighborliness. And when you have strong neighbors with skills, abilities, and inclinations, and strong communities, what you don't need is an attentive, all-encompassing state. The state, the need for the state and state help and really welfare policies diminish. It's Wilhelm Röpke said something really remarkable that I quote in my book. This is the Swiss economist. He said that government organized relief for the masses is simply the crutch of a society crippled by proletarianism, an expedient adapted to the economic and moral immaturity of the classes which emerged from the decomposition of the old social order. So he's seeing the same thing in the wake of World War II, a kind of breakdown of healthy communities that don't provide the opportunity for economic and moral maturity. And economic and morally immature people demand goods and services now. And again, for free healthcare, free college tuition. Just go down the list of how our contemporary socialists are tickling the ears of those insecure citizens by the language of freedom. It's as if they have no idea how a balance sheet works or how basic economics works, that you cannot invent wealth out of thin air. You can't just wave a pen and create money, although it seems that our government imagines that's possible.
The quote you just gave from Wilhelm Röpke reminds me of an anecdote, which I don't think you tell in your book. Maybe you'll know this one, because I think Russell Kirk tells it somewhere that Röpke and Hayek are together. So I want to say it's Hayek.
I think it was von Mises.
Von Mises. You know the anecdote. Yeah, right. Well, I'll let you tell it.
Well, it's in the wake of World War II. Apparently, they're walking through a little German or Swiss German village, I believe, with little homes, individual homes, and small kitchen gardens in the backyard, and it was Kirk, I suppose, who, if this is, there's debate whether this is a true story, but it's a wonderful little anecdote if it's not. Röpke said something along the lines of, pointed out the gardens and just how kind of lovely they were. And the economist, von Mises, sniffed and said it's a very inefficient way to produce vegetables. Whereupon Röpke replied, but perhaps a very efficient way of producing happiness.
Right. Which I thought is such a great anecdote. But yet, as you were saying, we seem now to think that happiness is the fruit of not having to worry about things like private property. In fact, you give a quote, I could not believe this is real, in your book, from the World Economic Forum, which is at least is a known thing. And the predicting by 2030, the World Economic Forum, that by 2030 you will own nothing and be happy.
Yeah. Isn't that awesome?
How just wrong-minded can you be about human nature?
It's remarkable, and if you dig around in the World Economic Forum, but it's not just them. There's a whole cabal, is sort of the Davos crowd that is imagining just this: that ownership is a burden. Ownership creates inequalities, and inequalities create dissension. And so, if we can just get rid of ownership, we can get rid of dissension, and harmony will break out. It's a kind of remarkable utopian aspiration. And you can trace the same kind of thinking right back to the French Revolution and every revolutionary movement since then. They all target private property. They all imagine that private property is somehow the problem. And if we can simply transcend our demand for private property, everything will be fine. It's a persistent lie that keeps reemerging. And maybe we're just doomed to deal with this reasserting itself every generation, but we're right in the thick of it now. And it's not just in America. As you point out, the World Economic Forum, they're pushing this. Some of the major foundations in the world are pushing this kind of nonsense, and it is dangerous. And one thing that's really interesting, and something I try to point out in my book, is one feature of this utopian dream is a world where work is no longer necessary. You see it in policy. We'll just have guaranteed income regardless of work. But it's a kind of, as you're already right to point out, a kind of unhuman aspiration to a life where work is not necessary. That human beings are somehow condemned to work, and therefore all work is something that is undesirable and something from which to escape. And the ideal sort of life is a life of plenty and security without any need to work.
No effort, no suffering at all at any level, no sense of earned reward for
or even the kind of creative expansion of one's imagination through an encounter with the material world. That's what work is in large respect. It's an attempt to, you can think of it in biblical terms, right? Take dominion, sort of to assert ourselves in a productive, creative, and beautiful way in the creation in which we find ourselves.
You point out, work. I like the way you put that. Work is one of the principal domains of our creativity, or the expected creativity. It's also one of the principal domains of our striving for excellence, for achievement. Aren't these things central to the human condition and necessary for happiness? I know the question seems to answer itself, but that's why I wonder if these people who say these sorts of things about work are serious, or whether this is all rhetoric ginned up for some other purpose. That sounds way too editorial. That's not. I don't mean it in an editorial way, but whether this is sort of like closing the door behind you. We've got what we need. Let's keep everybody else out.
I think it might be more than that. Actually, it's not a coincidence, I think, that these kind of inhuman aspirations, a world devoid of work, a world where you'll own nothing and be happy, is accompanied sort of at our same historic moment by the rise of transhumanism and an aspiration to transcend the body. That there is a kind of hostility to embodied reality, to human limits are seen as something that are that need to be transcended. They need to be destroyed. And there's a better way of being if we can simply transcend the limits that we seem to be stuck with, given by history, biology, and all of the things that human beings for millennia have been, in a sense, saddled with, or we might say blessed by.
Yeah, because you mentioned in your book, I like that connection, that property ownership, working with real property, inculcates the wisdom of limits. And so, right, it makes sense that if that's the case, then as people become more alienated from property, the less realistic they become about limits.
And what that means is the more separated from reality they become.
Right.
And
And less happy, more anxious.
Less happy, yeah, because you're actually undercutting the very conditions necessary for human flourishing. But when you're separated from reality in rational terms, that's a pretty good description or definition of insanity.
I think that's true. So let me ask you a question. I'll be slightly devil's advocate here, but it's a serious question in some ways. Are we doomed, human beings, to proletarianization? In other words, was the American experience, because of the frontier, all this, purportedly free land? I know there's quite the reality of the situation. There were inhabitants here, but there was we had the ability as Americans spread westward to sort of just kind of keep making land available, a real property, private property in its most important sense, probably in the perspective that we're talking about here. So we're just lucky, and so basically now we're fated to the end that we were always ultimately pointed toward.
If land is the quintessential version of property, and there's no way to think about property ownership in this healthy way that we're talking about, apart from, 40 acres and a mule, we're doomed. I don't think that's the case.
Good. I'm glad you said that.
I think there are other ways to think about property. And even in a industrialized society, E.F. Schumacher speaks in terms of human scale technologies. That is, even factories or enterprises that can be scaled in such a way that individuals or small groups of people can own those means of production. That's a really good thing. Barriers to entry or eliminating barriers to entry so people can start their own business. Even say an internet business still requires and calls forth virtues that are cultivated by the ownership of land. You can't making jewelry and selling those pieces on Etsy to people around the world. There's still the obligations of ownership and the limits that are produced by sort of living within those obligations are real. I think something that needs to be explored is equity sharing in corporation. That doesn't necessarily mean worker-owned companies, although that's really interesting, because what that does is really bridges that gap between ownership or labor and ownership that is so often acrimonious. But what happens if workers are acquiring some equity in the company along with their wages? Suddenly they're thinking differently. Suddenly when we say, well, if we do well this quarter, there's going to be a certain, there's a raise, or you actually acquire some kind of ownership stake in the company. How are those workers going to think? What kind of what is the temporal horizon that is going to expand? They're going to be thinking longer term about the long-term health of this enterprise. They might be picking up trash on the floor unbidden because, well, that's just going to get in the way of our production, and they're maybe going to be thinking about, how can I improve this process? Because if I improve this process, well, that's going to contribute to the wealth of the company, and that redounds to me. So there's interesting ways that we can think of even ownership that doesn't have to imply land, farm, plow, kind of traditional agrarian ownership.
Are there other things you've thought about that might be done to restore private property centrality sort of to our order? I mean, you really don't hear people talk about this, Mark, I'll be honest with you, right? We hear people talk about nationalism now, that's the way forward, a more and healthier way. But you don't really hear much about private property. It almost seems passé to talk about private property. What are your thoughts on that? Like other things that might be done, or how do you even get it back into the conversation?
Yeah, I think you're right. That not nearly enough people are talking about it. And when people do even kind of gesture in that direction, they talk more about wealth than property. and how do we create generational wealth, for instance, so that Uncle Jim can pass on a big bank account, nest egg to his kids, and that's not the same thing as passing on a piece of property, a business, piece of land, a competence, as Lash calls it, that really does connect one to generations, that encourages forward thinking. I need to preserve this. I need to my hand in this that I've inherited is, and my responsibility is to care for it well, improve it if I can, so that I can pass it on to my kids. And so at the end of the day, what I really push for in the book is a conception of property that encourages stewardship. Because I think not all conceptions of property are equal. Many libertarians, they speak in kind of absolutist terms. Well, it's my property. I can do with it what I want. And that this sort of has fallout even in terms of how we think about our body, right? My body, my choice, and all the rest. And I can do with it whatever I please. But if we think of ourselves as steward, as caretakers of the property that we possess, this creates a disposition that extends beyond physical property. It extends to the natural world. It extends to our cultural inheritance, the goods that we have inherited that produce the free society that we enjoy. It even will extend to the way we think about our bodies and our responsibility to ourselves and to others around us. So I think really the key is ownership framed in terms of stewardship. And obviously, as soon as we go down that road, the sort of theological implications may start to jangle a little bit, and I think they are there. But I think we can still talk about stewardship in a way that isn't explicitly theological. But it's absolutely necessary to get generational care rather than simply care within my own horizon of concerns.
That seems like a good place to leave this discussion. Mark Mitchell, thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's great talking.
Yeah, the book is Plutocratic Socialism, The Future of Private Property and the Fate of the Middle Class. Please don't buy it from the plutocrats at Amazon.com. Mark does all that. Mark, where do you want people to buy the book?
From your local bookstore.
There's an idea. You have a local bookstore? There's bookshop.org and bookshop.com, which buys from local bookstores, by the way, if you don't know that. Also, you can buy alibris.com, allows you to buy whatever seller or buyer you want. All of those are your non-Amazon options. We're always pushing those here on this podcast. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. And good luck with your own private property there in Virginia.
Thank you, Jeremy. Take care.